Right, hi everybody. I'm going to be going over some of this test review for evolution. So starting right off with the math stuff. The frequency of the white fur allele in the initial population of these rabbits. So if it's asking me for the frequency of the allele, I know that I am looking for Q. And 7% of the rabbits have white fur. White fur is recessive, so I do 0.07, make sure you don't do 0.7, 7% is 0.07, equals Q squared, which is the individuals who have the white fur. So they are homozygous recessive, so they are Q squared, not Q. In order to solve for Q, just take the square root of both sides, and I get, for part A, Q equals 0.265. Part B is kind of the same thing, except this time we have 19% of the rabbits with white fur. So 19 equals Q squared. Square root both sides, or sorry, 0.19 equals Q squared. Square root both sides. And for the second generation, we get Q equals 0.436. For part C, if the population has reached Hardy-Weinberg, we expect that the frequency of the white fur allele will not change, so we would expect Q to remain 0.436 in the next generation. Next, we have our chi-square test. So for our chi-square test, first we need a null hypothesis. In this case, our null hypothesis will be that significant evolutionary change has not occurred from the initial population to the current population. Then our table. So we'll put brown here, white here, observed, expected, and then I'm writing with my fingers, this is going to be hard, but observed minus expected squared divided by expected. Okay, so for observed, we are going to use the numbers from the second generation. So 83 rabbits, 19% have white fur. 19% of 83, or 0.19 times 83, gives us 16 white rabbits observed. And then if there's 83, the remainder of them, so 83 minus 16, gives us 67 brown rabbits. And then for expected, we expect, if there has been no significant evolutionary change, the second generation of rabbits would have the same percentage of white and brown rabbits as the first generation. So in this case, the first generation had 7% white rabbits, so we would do 0.07 times 83, and we would get an expected 6 white rabbits, and then 83 minus 6 is, we would expect 77 brown rabbits. Again, we expect the percentages from the first generation to be the same in the second generation. Not the number, but the percentages. Also remember, you cannot put percentages or decimals or whatever in your observed and expected boxes. Those have to be an actual number of rabbits. All right, if we do the math for the final box, we get 1.3 here and 16.7 there. So to get our chi-square value, we have to add those together. And then we get chi-square is going to equal 18. We have 1 degree of freedom since we have 2 categories. So if we look at the table and find the critical value for that is going to be 3.84. And then we compare 18 and 3.84. 18 is larger than 3.84. That means we must reject our null hypothesis, and we must say that yes, these two groups are significantly different. Significant evolutionary change has occurred here. For the last part, part E, it's really just asking you to explain the shift through the tenets of natural selection. So we'll start out with, more baby rabbits are born than are going to survive. Variation, so some of the rabbits have white fur and some of the rabbits have brown fur. There's variation in that population. In the particularly snowy environment, Having white fur is a beneficial trait because that allows the rabbits to blend in and not get eaten as easily by predators, which increases their chances of surviving, which increases their chances of growing to adulthood and reproducing successfully. And then the last part of it is the white rabbits will pass on the white fur trait to their offspring, and white fur will become more common in the rabbit population. So everything I just said, you really needed to have all of that in there for a complete answer, including the part where the trait gets passed on and becomes more common in the next generation. That's a part that people kind of skip over a lot of the time. The word theory, so the word theory as used by scientists means something that there is a lot of evidence for, a lot of supporting evidence. It's not the same as a guess, and it is appropriate to call evolution a theory because it is an explanation that has a lot of supporting evidence. And it's appropriate to call natural selection a theory as well. Sexual reproduction and mutation act to increase genetic diversity. Sexual reproduction is sort of a reshuffling of the genes, creating new combinations, and then mutations introduce new genes into the gene pool. The conditions for Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, so we've got no natural selection, no sexual selection, no migration, no mutations, and a large population size, so no genetic drift. If a population meets all these conditions, it is said to be at Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. If it does not meet all of those conditions, we would say that population is evolving. The next set of things are mostly definitions, which I think you can get directly from your notes. And same with most of these are mostly definitions and examples that you should be able to get from the evidence for evolution slideshow. Make sure you understand the difference between convergent and divergent evolution, that idea that organisms can evolve to be more similar if they are in similar environments, even if they are not closely related, because sort of the same traits that are useful in that environment for one species might also be useful for another species in that same environment. Make sure you can explain the idea of antibiotic resistance evolving in bacteria. That was the one with the plates, where all of the bacteria that are not resistant to the antibiotic get killed, whereas the ones that are resistant have a better chance of surviving. And they did not become resistant because of the antibiotic. They just so happened to have a mutation that randomly made them resistant, that became favorable and selected for in the environment with the antibiotic. And then the next generation of bacteria are all going to be descendants of those resistant bacteria, and so they will be resistant. And therefore, there has been, as per our definition of evolution, a change in the genetic composition of a population from one generation to the next. Genetic diversity is important for the survival of the population because of that idea. If a new pathogen or some new environmental condition happens, what kills one of them hopefully won't kill all of them if they have diverse genetics. There might be some that are able to survive better, whereas if all of the individuals are basically the same, what kills one of them probably is going to kill all of them. A species, according to the biological species concept, is organisms that can reproduce together and produce offspring that is both viable and fertile. Prezygotic and postzygotic barriers are things that prevent closely related species from interbreeding and creating viable and fertile offspring. The prezygotic barriers would be things that prevent them from creating a zygote or a fertilized egg in the first place. For example, mating at different times of year, having different mating dances or rituals, having different preferred habitats in the same area. Maybe just their parts like literally don't fit together. A postzygotic barrier would be something where maybe they can produce offspring, but their offspring are either not fertile, like a mule, or they are not viable, like the liger. The two forms of speciation are allopatric and sympatric, where allopatric occurs when there's a physical barrier separating two groups, and so there is a loss of gene flow. There's a loss of interbreeding between those two groups, and eventually they can evolve into separate species. Sympatric is where there is a loss of gene flow, but there is no physical barrier separating those two groups. Adaptive radiation, the classic example is Darwin's finches. That's where one species evolves into many. We would expect that to occur after, say, a large extinction event where much of the competition of a certain species has been wiped out, or when a species moves to a new environment or gets transported to a new environment where they are able to sort of exploit that new environment and adapt to fill different roles in that new environment. Divergent evolution is one of the ways we get speciation. It's when things are evolving to be more different from each other. Convergent evolution, again, ties in with those analogous structures, and it's when different species are evolving to be more similar to each other due to similar environmental pressures. Gradualism, the idea that evolution is kind of slow and steady. Punctuated equilibrium is the idea that evolution is sort of stable, and then there's bursts of more evolution that occur after, say, large environmental upheavals, and the evidence more closely supports the punctuated equilibrium model, especially considering the major extinction events that have occurred on our planet and subsequent bursts of new species following those extinction events. Why do we think all life is related? Another way to say that is, what does all life have in common? What are homologous structures or molecular homologies that we have all inherited? And so things like ribosomes, a need for water, our cell membranes are all very similar, the use of DNA as a common genetic code, and the use of glycolysis as a common energy releasing pathway. These are all evidence that all life has some, single origin that all life, again, inherited those characteristics from. A cladogram that is based on molecular similarities is generally more accurate than a cladogram that is based on physical similarities. And then again, there's a note here, please study your practice sheet on phylogenetic trees. You need to be able to draw them, you need to be able to interpret them, you need to be able to say, what is the closest common ancestor of this and this based on a tree? Also, what is the most closely related species to this other species based on a tree? All right, so that's all I'm going to go over on this, but if you have any additional questions, as always, please ask.